So we have already learned how to write functions in JavaScript, but there is actually another way of writing functions, and that is by doing something called arrow functions. And let's start by commenting out most of this code that we wrote. Again, we don't need that anymore. So open the comment and then close it here, but we will keep this function here. So the original way of writing functions. But as I said at the beginning of the video, there is actually another way of writing functions in JavaScript using the arrow function. So the goal of arrow functions is to write very short functions all in one line, and also without using the return keyword. So let me show you what I mean. Let's simplify this here a little bit. Get rid of this function call maybe. Yeah. So when we write an arrow function, we actually define it as a variable. So let's say const calc age or calc fact age2. All right, and then we say equal. And so now here we write our function, and that function will then basically be a value that is assigned. So it's stored inside this variable, and then we can use the function just like before. So just like this one. So the way that this works is that basically we give the function an input. So we write parentheses just like we did here. Then we write our input and then simply an arrow. And whatever comes after the arrow will automatically be returned without us writing the return keyword. So let's start with the most basic form of this function, just like we started the other one. So let's say 2022 minus the year that was given. And that's it. That's all we need to do to write an arrow function. So let me prove that to you by logging the result of calling it to the function, or actually to the console. So calc fact age2. Let's again use 2015 just to make sure. And indeed, we get the same result as before, also 7. And just to be really sure, let's replace the 2022 with the current year automatically calculated by JavaScript. So I will just copy this and replace the 2022 here. Give it a save, and yeah, we still get 7. And so this function is now doing the same job as this one here, but only in one line of code. Well, not exactly the same thing, because it doesn't have this condition here yet. But for now, what matters is that we can write a function like this. So we simply give it an input. And if it was multiple inputs, then we would separate them by a comma. And the same is true for normal functions. So let's say it also needed x, or this one as well. So we could keep asking for more and more input data. But here we don't need that. And here also not. So we just give it some input, then we write the arrow, and whatever value comes then will be returned from the function. And this is really, really useful in many situations. We will use it in this section here later when we work with arrays, and also in React in the next section, we will need it all the time. So we are going to write arrow functions all the time, so it's important that you start getting used to them. Okay, but now let's see what happens when we try to call the function with the 2037. So basically with a fact from the future. So then we get the -15, of course, which is because here we are not doing the check. So we don't have the condition checking for the age as we have here. And so let's try to incorporate something similar here. So how do you think we could do this? How could we create a condition here which simply returns a value? Well, that's where our ternary operator gets into play once again. So what we can do now is to use a ternary operator. However, here we will have a slightly different condition because here we are checking based on the age, and that's possible because we calculated the age first. But here we cannot really do any variable definitions inside of this one line of code. right? Because remember that here we can basically only calculate one value, which then immediately gets returned. So instead, what we can do is to check if the year that was passed in is less or equal the current year. And that current year is this. So we can just copy it here, and then the value will get calculated twice, but that's not a big problem. So in this case, and so the ternary operator now again, then what we had before will be returned. But otherwise, we want this string again. Well, it will need to be a little bit different because here we don't have the current year. So let's simply copy this again and paste it here. So the value will be once again regenerated, but that's no big deal. So it looks very confusing now, but once I save this, Prettier will make it look acceptable. Okay, and it still is a bit confusing, but let's go through it step by step. So it's a ternary operator, right? And the need for the ternary operator is that we need simply one value here as the return value for this function, because it's an arrow function, and so it simply returns one value. So the value that comes after the arrow. So if we need a condition, we can use the ternary operator. And here the condition is this one. So is the year that we gave it less than the current year? So here in this example, 2015 is of course less than the current year. And so then the condition is true, and then we simply return the fact age just like we did before. So basically what we have here is the exact equivalent of this. The only difference is that we stored the current year in a variable here first. But conceptually and in terms of values, it's exactly the same thing. And then if this is not true, then we simply return the same string as before. And we also recalculate the current year, which is no problem at all. And so this function is now completely equivalent to this one. We simply did it as an arrow function, so without any return keyword. Now, just as a side note, the truth is that actually an arrow function can also have multiple lines of code, and it can also use the return keyword to return something at the end of it. But that's not important right now, because in that case, we can simply use a function like this. So we use, or at least I prefer to use the arrow function only in a situation where we need a fast, usually a one-line function, for example in React, or as a callback function, as we will see a bit later in the section. So this is going to be super important, so hopefully you understood how this works. And again, if this looks too confusing, it's just because we basically used two concepts at once. Just remember that before we had simply this. So 2022 minus the year. And so hopefully that doesn't look as confusing. And so I will just leave it here as a comment for you so that you can see just this concept of arrow functions without mixing all this other stuff in. Great. We're making amazing progress here. You already learned so many different concepts here in this short amount of time, and we will keep going forward in this section. Next up are arrays.